to another episode of BoxTalks, an attempt to gather various perspectives on climbing and its many facets. I'm Vrinda Bugera, and with me today is Prerna Dangi as co-host. Our guest for the day is Madeleine Cope, also known as Maddy. Maddy's been climbing for 11 years now, and she's also a coach with Lattice Training. She's based out of Sheffield in the UK, and for those of you who don't know what Lattice Training is, it's a data-driven platform for climbing training started by Tom Randall and Ollie Torr. Maddy's a versatile climber and has significant ascents in both trad and sport climbing. To list a few, she's climbed the massively run-out 8B Plus Prinz of Hoffnung in Austria, Once Upon a Time in the Southwest, graded E9 in North Devon in the UK, and the endurance-heavy Mind Control 8C in Oliana, Spain. Today, we're going to try and pick her brains on climbing training with a focus on women, and I'm going to hand it over to Prerna to elaborate more on this.
Both Vrinda and I have been climbing for about 8 years now and have spent a considerable amount of time training together. Our training trajectory has had its share of hits and misses. We've often found ourselves super lost and in search of the right resources, adapting to easily available online training programs, and essentially trying to figure out what works for us. We've also found ourselves in need for expert opinion, and that's what we aim to bring to you today. As a climbing coach, Maddy gives us insight into the various aspects of training for climbing and the approach to it, how training can aid injury prevention, longevity in the sport, and pushing hard grades. We also talk about the differences in physiological markers, the inherent strengths that women bring into the sport, and the distribution of training around the menstrual cycle. Finally, we talk about training for power and the concept of fear, how to overcome it and expand our comfort zones. I also talk about our experience of climbing with women at CLAW, which stands for Climb Like a Woman, that was put together by a bunch of women that are passionate about the outdoors. It started as an annual women's climbing meetup in Hampi and is now working to create more opportunities for women in India to climb outdoors.
Before we get into the chat, just a quick heads up. We did have some tech issues while recording, so you won't be able to see Prerna and me, but you can see Maddy as she talks. Sorry about that, but we hope you enjoy this talk, and I hope it's worth your time. Thanks a lot. Hi, Maddy. Thanks for joining us today. So I wanted to get to know a little bit about your journey into coaching for climbing. How long has it been? Were you coaching before Lattice? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess just from a climbing point of view now, I've been climbing for probably like 11-ish years. So it very much developed into like a big passion of mine, a little bit like we just spoke about when I moved to Sheffield after university and sort of really found this community and this sort of process behind climbing, which maybe I hadn't quite looked into before. And the training aspect sort of, I think, naturally fell into that.
Mm-hmm.
I think before moving to Sheffield and sort of thinking about the physical side of things, I mainly did like trad climbing. So if anything, I'd thought about developing that more mental side of things and like building a confidence in that respect. So I think it was something new for me when I moved here for Sheffield. But at the time I was doing a different job. So I did like chemistry at university. I really loved like science and biochemistry and the body. But I worked much more in a sort of academic style job. And I did actually really enjoy the job, but I guess like both of you probably know, climbers love to have some freedom to sort of travel and climb. And so once my sort of passion had sort of grown and I realized this climbing was really something I wanted to be able to commit a bit more time to, I left that job and just went away traveling for a bit. And then actually it was almost by chance, to be honest, because I got chatting to Tom, who you bumped into at the station. And I think a nice thing about them is that they gave me the opportunity to come on board and learn. I guess I had this fundamental like science understanding, which you need for like the sort of science side of things, adapting to training and the body and stuff. And then I think I had this side of things that was personal experience about what I'd put into my own projects and my own training. And what I really wanted actually was that sort of more personal side of things where you got to work with other people on that. So I think, in a sense, I think I was very lucky because I was just talking to Tom about what I was doing and what I wanted, and they offered me a job and the opportunity to come on board and sort of learn that side of things from both them and the team that they have there. So and that's been sort of over a year now with them, and I think I've really enjoyed the job, but also learned so much from it as well. So yeah, that's sort of my story to where I am now. So I had done some coaching, but in terms of training plans and things, it was all from my personal sort of experience before I started working with Lattice. But I do think that that's a really good place to start, because I think through experimenting yourself and finding what works for you and what doesn't, I think it does give you that experience of being the other person, at the end, who's like doing their training plan. And I think, that's always an important part of it. And like everyone on the team has done lots of their own training for different projects or for like coming back from injuries. I think that sort of just general wealth of experience alongside the science geeky bit, which I really find interesting, I think is sort of what's landed me where I am now.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to see where climbing research has gone. You have a standardized fingerboard where you can compare relative finger strengths to climbers all over the world. I mean, I think Lattice has really taken this study to another level.
Yeah, like for sure. And I think that so I find that bit's obviously like a very interesting part of Lattice. And I think it's amazing to have collated so much data and I guess start to take climbing a little bit more like how other sports, this sort of thing, like physiological testing and performance markers have been present in other sports for years. And I guess alongside that, I think what everyone on the team, but what I really like to sort of keep in mind and push for is that although developing that gives us a lot, I think there's also working with every climber as an individual and sort of seeing that I think we are in quite an amazing sport where you don't have to be comparable to someone else exactly to climb the same thing or to climb what you want. And I think actually, like, quite interestingly, so the sort of Lattice data and everything that's compiled, I am like a massive outlier on any of those results. Yeah. So like I still think it's interesting, and I think it's a good place to start. It gives you, like, I think just benchmarking and giving like this sort of general overview of the different factors that are important to climbing, I think is obviously really valuable. But I think also using that as one tool amidst a set of many tools is what I really sort of think is valuable about the job, and having someone to look at your goals and all that information. I don't think it has to stand alone, because if it did for me, like I think I definitely wouldn't sort of, I think Tom did my assessment and he was pretty shocked at especially my finger strength. I struggle with a fingerboard. So.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, massively.
It doesn't look like that in the photo.
Yeah, it's all obviously like relative to like where like I maybe have been in the past, or certain routes that I've wanted to do. So the sort of process, I guess, of like looking at someone's goals as well as like their physical assessment and stuff. I think the important thing is to have that data set, but then to take the whole load of information. And that's something that I really enjoy, because I guess I feel like if I was on the receiving end, I would really need that.
Maddy, can you help us understand what training for climbing entails? Is it just climbing more, or how is training different from climbing itself?
Sure. Well, I think there's always this sort of idea we have that training for climbing is about like building this maximum strength, or like getting some certain score on the fingerboard, or or even just like it's all about progressing in this like physical sense. And I think that of course is like an undeniable part of it. Like, I've trained to try and get more, improve in certain physical aspects so that I maybe could go and try a certain route that I found really inspiring, and wanted to try. But actually, personally, for me, I got into training, and like where I started with it, like I said, when I moved to Sheffield, was more from a point of view of injury prevention. I think that it's not uncommon that to use training to build this really like strong foundation. I guess what I really love in climbing and what I hope to do, and what really inspires me, when I see some people out climbing near me and they're like maybe in their 50s getting towards their 60s and they're still just really enjoying this sport, and they look they're still like, their body is like physically able and they are healthy. I suppose for me, in terms of like a long-term goal, I want that to be me. I want to be enjoying climbing until I don't know what age, but you know what I mean, for like the sort of longevity of it. And I think that I don't know whether this was lucky or whether I was unlucky at the time, but I moved to Sheffield, and like you saw, Prerna, there's this sort of training community, which is really great. And I think I sort of dove in there and really wanted to be part of that, and really enjoyed it from a very like just simple physical challenge point of view. I think that's also something that maybe gets lost in the sort of progression or pushing past plateaus or like really wanting to get to 8A or whatever. I think that for me personally, and for a lot of people that I train with, I actually just really enjoy it. And I think that that's, I think certain sessions that we have are just, they're just a challenge, like climbing itself. But I did then suffer from, I think there is like a learning curve that goes with that, because I don't know about you guys, but I've had plenty of injuries in my shoulders, because it's obviously, I find it really fun, but that means that I really just threw myself at it. I think I didn't understand that you can't just go all out all the time. So I guess like training for me started off as like maintaining a like functional, healthy body along like whilst like progressing in climbing in the way I wanted. But for other people, training might be about time efficiency alongside like a really busy life schedule or work, or maybe like a change in life, maybe like having a family, or maybe getting a bit older and realizing that it is harder to maintain strength and it's harder to progress in those ways, and things feel a bit more tweaky. So I guess from a personal point of view, training, that is what training is for me. It's sort of like actually like a way of moderating what I do and like managing it so that I don't overdo it and actually get injured. And I think that's quite common in climbers. Like so many climbers I know, like we love our sport and we love to push ourselves, and actually for a lot of people, my friends and then also people that I work with, it's about slightly trying to find that minimum dosing where you can progress but also keep a healthy body and try and maintain good energy levels and recovery. So yeah, I think I would say that to me, and for a lot of people, I think that's what training boils down to, because even if they think, oh, I've got this goal that I want to do in 2 years, if they're going to get there, they have to be able to climb consistently.
Right.
So even in that sense, I think it sort of boils down to maintaining health and then also enjoyment. Like I think, like we might talk about, I obviously love training and I think that it's very useful for a number of things, but also not everyone enjoys training. So I think there's sort of a number one sort of rule that if you don't really enjoy it, then that is fine, and maybe it's not for you. And as long as you're not getting injured and you're enjoying your climbing, then that's great.
That actually leads right into my next question. I wanted to ask you about if you've noticed somewhat of a pattern in when people start training. Often, like you mentioned, it's an injury which requires them to rethink about how they're climbing, and maybe they need to tone their excitement for just climbing and training down, or if it's a goal in mind. Have you noticed that there's a pattern for at which stage in one's climbing lifespan do they want to start training? And is it different for men and for women?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question, and because it's one that we get quite a lot. I think people have this sort of idea. They're like, oh, I have to be a certain level, or I have to climb a certain amount of time. But I think that it's really hard to give any sort of absolutes there, because it's really nuanced situation, especially nowadays, I think, because, you know, if you go for like the amount of sort of time that someone's been climbing, that's a really hard way to judge it, because some people start climbing now, and because of the facilities that are around, they can just climb. So they might have only climbed for a year, but they've climbed loads in that year, and actually they've really progressed. Or you maybe think, oh, we should go for a certain level, like, you know, you must have climbed like 6B plus, I don't know, just pick some arbitrary level. But then everyone's different in their relative abilities, their strengths, the mental side, their technique, their time availability. So, you know, for someone, it might take them a year to climb that grade, and for someone else, it might take 5 years. So I think that sort of breaks down as a way as well. So I think that you kind of have to look at what is limiting you in your climbing. I think that that's like quite a good place to start. I mean, I do think there's like a general sort of learning climbing movement, or potentially if you're wanting to rope climb, there's obviously a learning phase for like the sort of technical aspect of it. And I think that once that sort of, you've built a good foundation there, and you will have naturally progressed somewhat, I think that training can come in, because I guess, like I said before, it doesn't have to be like one arm pull up straight away. We've got this training is this really like broad area with a lot of different variety in it, and so you can still look to work technique or execution in someone who's maybe not been climbing quite as long, and maybe you'd look to build a more solid foundation in the areas that quite commonly get injured, you know, because I think what we do see now in terms of a change over time is that I think actually quite a lot of people progress a bit quicker now in terms of basic strength development, because of like the facilities we have, the climbing walls. So I guess potentially training could be useful coming in a little bit earlier now than potentially 10 years ago, when it might just take people a bit longer to build that solid foundation. Right. So I think once you've built that, I think it's looking at what limits you. So there's like obviously the physical side of things, there's the mental side of things, and there's the technical side of things. But I do think that a training plan can slightly umbrella those things. I think for me, the actual process of training helped, and the sort of sessions you do definitely helped me deal a bit with like managing expectations and sort of dealing with failure, because of course certain like sessions and exercises you might do might have a certain degree of that. Helps you with execution, because it sort of maybe makes you try some things like a style of climbing that you might not do always. So I do think that that sort of has a value, potentially, especially, and it did this for me, and I don't know about other people, is that it did slightly push me out of my comfort zone, you know, in sort of a few different ways. And I think that that has a lot of value, sort of irrespective of the level you're at. But I think besides from that, I guess like what is a really common time for people to start a training program is, like you said, I think like plateauing, like wanting to, you know, I think you sort of reach that sort of natural level, whatever that may be for you. And then if you want to sort of push past that, I think sometimes there's a need for, that's like when you might want to introduce training into your climbing. Or I do think like injuries and sort of getting quite reoccurring injuries is then like, that's a really common common way for you to like introduce it. But I think what sort of going back to that enjoyment point, and what I see now with like clients starting and new climbers coming in, is that they also might have just come from a different sporting background. So I don't know if you see that in your climbing gym. Yeah, so, and they actually come from a background where training is quite a, you know, I guess a bit, I wouldn't say more normal, but or accepted, but it's just a little bit more like there's more infrastructure there. So they might have come from cycling or swimming. And I guess for them, I don't think they've come from a sport that really questions what level you're at before you start training. I think that in a way, I think some climbing communities and cultures have sort of nurtured that in a way that like training is only for this group of people. And I guess that doesn't resonate with me as much. I don't think it has to be this elite level thing that only certain people can do. I think it's understanding all the different things that you can get out of it. If you look for them. So I guess it's like I said, it's quite hard to say pinpoint an exact time. I think once the natural learning of climbing movement has been fulfilled with however many number of sessions that you're climbing wall or outdoors, and you think that there is something valuable from training that you would get, like time management or sort of reducing injury risk or working towards a goal or pushing past a plateau, and I think at that point it's to work with someone in making it right for the level that you're at. I guess like some training plans, depending on the level of the person, there's different sort of equipment or things that you might use. And so like at Lattice, I think we say you probably want to be comfortable hanging at body weight on a fingerboard, or just know how to hang on a fingerboard, just because that's part of our testing protocol. But that doesn't mean that in your plan that obviously it's to communicate with someone about what equipment is good for you at the level you're at, and that is what someone like a professional can look into.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I think we see this a lot over here, is mostly the elite climbers here, or like, the people who've pursued the sport for a slightly longer period of time are the ones that are pursuing training more seriously. And there is this perception that if you've just gotten into it, or if you're new to climbing, is training really for you? So my question was essentially to kind of understand what that is and why that exists, because it is like a bit of a cultural thing. You see the people who've climbed for 10 years are the only ones training, and so you automatically sort of assume that maybe I need to wait for that long before I start training,
Yeah. And I mean, I think that a lot of that culture is just sort of the product of the evolution of climbing. So I guess I sort of compared to other sports, say, well, swimming or cycling or like gymnastics, that kids do, and they're like training straight away. It's quite like an intense, structure. And I just think that climbing's a little behind that, I guess, in its development in that way. And I think with it starting as this, I guess from mountaineering, and then there's like obviously rock climbing, and then from that there came bolting. I think that history in climbing sits in a place that is a little bit less training centric and a little bit less sort of, I guess it's not that it wasn't performance focused, because obviously there was a sort of egotistical side of it, of certain groups wanting to be the first to reach the top of the mountain and all that stuff. I just think it's slightly different to other sports that from the offset had a little bit more of maybe a competition aspect to them or something. They were a little bit more structured from the beginning, and I think that climbing didn't start in that place, but is sort of evolved to that place. So I think that's where we're just slightly waiting to catch up maybe on some of the culture surrounding that.
Yeah, I think those are like really valid points on how everybody organically kind of takes up training. And definitely there's a difference in when somebody's coming from a sports background, or even from the competition background, which was my case, Rinda, because I started with competitions, and the sense of training and the reason for it came because everybody around me was training, and I was like, oh, okay, that's what I need to do in order to win this next comp or something like that. And then I had an injury, which changed my reasons for training. but it also sort of brought in a big aspect, a psychological aspect of fear of returning to climbing. And I was one of those all-out climbers, and from the people who I looked up to were like, oh, you just have to keep going at it. So I also had this, attitude of, just be fearless and throw yourself, like you mentioned, Paddy, and that didn't really work out. It does
Yeah.
work out for some, I think, but like, I mean, I think there's a point where you can hit a dead end even with that. But what was it like for you, for example? Like when I think of training after my injury, I'm thinking it was, a lot of it was to do with getting over this fear of re-injuring myself. So I felt like I needed to be stronger than the problems that I wanted to do in order to not, injure myself. But fortunately, in that process, I learned to overcome the psychological fear, but also, regain this ability to push myself beyond what I'm able. Because I think that was the biggest lag that remained in my climbing, and kind of, that was my reason to plateau, sort of.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned that sort of overcoming the fear of like pushing your body after an injury, because yeah, I completely sort of agree that was the process that I went through after injuring both shoulders numerous times. But I think that what training allows you to do is sort of not only obviously build back your sort of physical strength, develop certain muscles that were maybe either undeveloped or have atrophied a bit because you haven't been using them because you've had time off. But also, I think it gives you this way to approach sort of, I guess, the sort of logical steps. So it's like you develop those muscles. Like for me, with my shoulders, it was like wide moves, and like stretched out moves that really I was scared of because I didn't want to re-injure my shoulder. And I felt like you've got this process where you can use your training to rebuild those, and that gives you a certain confidence to then like apply those to the wall. Because yeah, for me, I think that was, for a long time after my injury, that was kind of what was holding me back, because like you said, I think you can develop the strength to be over strong. And I think the really important part that training needs to do is to transfer that to the wall, because ultimately, what we all want to do is climb, and climb without fear of like injuring re-injuring a shoulder, or just without all the other fears that come with climbing, that go beyond that. So I think that's what I guess is a really important step in training itself, is that transfer from like building like the strength in the certain areas, in quite an isolated way, like doing shoulder work or TRX and I think that what has maybe sort of contributed to this culture, or this sort of like some of these misconceptions around training and its usefulness, and is maybe the lack of that transfer step back to actual climbing and thinking about how you're going to incorporate that strength into your climbing, which maybe involves learning new movements, maybe involves like building up some confidence around certain movements. So I think that step, like you said, is a really important one. And I think that was quite like an epiphany for me in training, shall we say, that like I could build up all this strength, but actually I was still going climbing and not committing to wide moves, or not really transferring it. So yeah, I think that's definitely been very much part of the learning curve for me in training, that I try to really sort of relate to anyone else who's doing training, is that you do really need to work at whatever is holding you back in transferring it to the wall, whether that is just learning the movements and just like going out and trying it, whether there is some fear around a certain thing, or whether there is a certain technique that needs developing. Yeah, and I think that step's really important. But something that I think is, don't know, for me, I don't know if you guys have found this as part of like your process, especially if you have come from like getting into more structured training from injury, is that I guess when we build training plans, or when you do training sessions, you obviously learn this difference between sessions. Some are high intensity, some are low intensity, and within a certain week you might do a certain number of high intensity ones and a certain number of low. lower intensity ones. And there's this idea of load, I guess. And I guess what I really learn and think it's really valuable for anyone to learn is sort of applying that idea of load to the bigger picture, I think. So like, I guess what training and learning more about training and training other people who maybe have really busy family lives or other stresses, you know, I think it's this understanding of overall load and stress in your life, of which climbing and physical training is this one segment, and that the other part really needs to be respected as well. We actually call it, it's got a term, it's called like allostatic load. So it's essentially just this concept that your energy, or however you might view your sort of capacity as a person, is like all one bucket. And if you fill it with a certain amount of load or stress from work, or, you know, this current situation's been quite interesting. People are trying to homeschool their children and shift to work from home. You know, then you fill that bucket to a certain extent with this other stuff, and then training goes in on top of that. And I think, I don't know if you have felt that, you guys, it would be interesting, but that's something that I felt when I started training, and I almost feel like it showed me that more because I hadn't really thought about the load in my climbing before. So I think that shift in thinking actually made me respect the other things in my life more that could sort of have an impact on my climbing. And so now I haven't sort of been injured. I think I've not been injured for ages. And obviously maybe knowing more about my trainings is part of that. But I think sort of applying that training mindset and process to the greater picture has been really useful for me. You know, I think there's quite a lot of talk now, which I think is really good and interesting, around like, how is training different for females? And I think it is different in a number of ways, but I'll come back to that. But I think first and foremost, it's that training is different for everyone. Gender aside, like everyone's got different capacities, different schedules, different sort of lifestyle, other elements, different goals, different relative strengths and weaknesses. So I think first and foremost, like when anyone goes to either like think about training for themselves or help a friend, or like more in a professional capacity like myself, I think you treat everyone very differently. And then you sort of learn what, you know, say with scheduling, like, you know, quite a lot of people now are like, oh, you know, is it different for females with obviously like the hormonal fluctuations throughout the month? And I think there are differences there, but also that is just at its like foundation, learning to schedule your training in the way that works for you. It is just an extension of that females need this like maybe few more set of like tools in their toolkit to sort of be informed about the changes they could make there. But ultimately, I guess like I've looked a lot into this and thought about sort of wanting to educate around it. But if you took out the sort of hormone bit or female bit, it would just apply to everyone, actually, a lot of these rules. But I do think there's gender differences with like the hormone fluctuations and recovery and injury risk, actually. Like when you look into it, there's not been a vast amount of research maybe in like injury distribution in climbing, but there is in other sports, and there is a little bit in climbing as well. And females of equivalent sort of level, you know, as to a male, they are at a higher risk of getting injured. So I think when it comes to whether training is different for a female or male, I think that there is differences there in sort of recovery and sort of injury risk. But also, I don't know whether you guys find this. I think that like when it comes to training for females, Prerna, I know you said it was really nice to like come to Sheffield, and there was actually quite a big female community, because I think a little bit of what I get asked about is sort of how it's different for females. Like, I don't know how to phrase it. Like they sort of feel like there's more barriers there. Like training isn't feminine, or maybe like building upper body strength or muscles is not as feminine, or they're worried about that, or they don't want that. You know, there's sort of this like, I don't even know what you'd call it. I don't know if it's just like a sort of cultural thing, as well as like maybe a bit of a body image thing to go with training. So I don't know if that you like sort of get a lot of that maybe with the the women you climb with or when you've done your events?
Body image is definitely a factor that affects women pursuing the sport, especially at the entry level. But the scene in India right now is very young, and there just aren't that many women climbing. Therefore, there's not as many women invested in training. From Claw, however, which is like, this one place where we actually got a bunch of women to actively choose to climb, right? That I think that from my experience there, I definitely, like, those were all, like, amazing women who were just like out to do either try this unique experience for the first time, or knowing what climbing is, they wanted to climb with better climbers and to get more into the sport and to like learn about the sport. And all of them were just like completely nonchalant about all of these other obstacles that could be for some women. And it was pretty amazing to just like I don't know, I think it's just something about climbing that climbers, and you can tell that this person is going to really like remain in the sport because they come in so wholeheartedly into sport. And they like all of nothing exists then when you want to climb. You just like take up the sport and you do whatever you can to kind of go get into it and throw yourself into it. And I remember a lot of women there aspired for muscles and for this upper body strength. And the problem there, in fact, the missing thing was maybe the fear of not being strong enough. and so even if they do, if there is, because there's like a lack of this visible representation of strong muscular women, and this is something the sport definitely requires. Especially at a higher level, once you're at whatever grade that you want to climb at, etc. But for the beginner climber, women climbers, it's also a little detrimental because it's instantly, something that sets you apart from this person who is so strong looking, and makes this objective or this even sport a little more distant than, because you like immediately think, oh, this is why I can't, like, I will never be as strong. And I have felt this so many times, is why I know that it's always there. You look at a strong person and you always visibly relate their body to their climbing. It just comes naturally. And it takes a lot of like stopping yourself from making these assumptions, and actually, which is just like climbing with people who look different. And that's also achieved in Claw. And we saw that so many women just like gained so much from looking at each other, more than rather than us who were the mentors. They felt inspired to just see another person who's starting climbing get on top of the boulder. So it's definitely this there is a fear, and that makes me want to go into our next question, which is how do women need to adapt to training differently, essentially, and what are the focus areas that we need to spend more time on?
Yeah. So before I dive into that, I just think it's a really interesting question, that sort of point that you brought up about sort of that sort of, it's the sort of us and them mentality, isn't it? Like when you sort of view, like, say, if like in terms of representation, you get like a lot of representing of these like super strong female athletes, these honed bodies that you think are sort of a million miles away, and they've got loads of upper body strength, and you think, and I can completely see how it would actually be sort of intimidating from the other direction for females thinking, who do naturally probably, for a female walking off the street just wanting to get into climbing, probably do have less upper body strength than the male. And I think something that is really good now, and you might see this as well in your climbing wall, is that definitely in the climbing walls in Sheffield and the outdoors, is that there's a bit of a shift to being a lot of like quite technical climbs and like stuff that don't actually require as much upper body strength. And I think sort of actually personally for me, something I really love about climbing are those more wall climbs, those climbs that don't require that same upper body strength, and that I actually see a lot of females, generally speaking, with good sense of balance and quite delicate footwork, really like doing really well on. So maybe a way to sort of try and break down that barrier is to make sure that a lot of what is advertised or shared or whatever is actually this climbing is this quite like delicate, precise, like sort of dancing on rock type sport as well, which I think I've actually luckily grown up with a bit of that idea. And I think I've seen a shift. Like when I started climbing, the climbing wall they were all overhanging, all steep. So of course, like actually I was like, wow, feel like I need more body strength. But now when I go to the wall, I see a really like vast array of angles and stuff. And so I do think in terms of that, we're moving in the right direction there. But sort of going back to more sort of like training and like what is it like for a female training, and what do they maybe need to do different. And I think there's like sort of two quite topical areas here. There is just how is training different for women in sort of like, I guess at Lattice we collect a lot of data, and there is some general things that women, like you said, like when women come into climbing and they're first looking to train, often upper body strength is something that is like a little bit less naturally developed, and also because we are generally shorter, for any given climb we might just need more upper body strength, just to get from A to B. For us, if it's further in general, then this is often something that is quite like prominent in an early stage of training, because it also feeds into that sort of injury prone, that like maybe if females are often a bit more extended, their shoulders are in quite a much like vulnerable position more often, and then maybe building that strong foundation of shoulder strength is also really important. So I guess coming into things, probably a female in terms of like just a difference in focus to males. Like I think there's probably like sort of shoulder engagement, shoulder strength building, and sort of like upper body strength building. And I think the important thing to sort of, like you said, so that it's not this intimidating thing, you don't have to be able to do loads of pull-ups, is that there's lots of ways of doing this, like using like assistance for like bands, so that you don't need to be able to do a body weight pull-up at all to like do pull-ups and to really benefit from them, as well as like TRX type exercises, and like shoulder engagement stuff to work the shoulders. And I think that for a general, if females are looking for something to like work on, that is probably going to be quite beneficial for them. And I think the other thing that's often like maybe missed in the sort of, we all want to do pull-ups, we feel like working on pull-ups is obviously like great for us. I think we can sort of slightly forget about, although I think it's a good place to start, how diverse climbing movement is. So like, I mean, it took me a long time. I was really good at pull-ups, but actually as soon as I went into like a wide pull-up, because I realized when I was on the wall, not all the holds were right here in front of me, they're sort of everywhere. I think like working in those variety of positions, even if you need assistance or anything, can be really beneficial in terms of like we said, sort of transferring that strength to the wall. So I think that's really good. Like we often find actually like in the data set that like females to climb a certain grade often have less finger strength than their sort of equivalent male. And I think the sort of hypothesis for this is that females often have like better hip flexibility, so their center of gravity and their weight sits a bit closer to the wall, and they can potentially move in a slightly more economic way, and they maybe don't need to use certain like strengths as much. So I think that's quite like an important thing to put out there as well, that women are not just in general as a population behind on all these physiological markers. They we have some real strengths as well, and I think it's a balance between developing those strengths whilst also working on like maybe some of the pull and more power sort of based things, which as a whole women potentially need to develop like a little bit more, is quite like a good way to sort of get a balance for things. And also just like you said, as a sort of point of not finding it too intimidating a thing to approach. It's not like you're going to have to work on all these things. That's not what training is. It's about developing some of your strengths so that you can really use them. as well as working on some weaknesses that will really, have a big impact on your climbing, looking for your limiting factors. And then I think the sort of second part, which is really topical of like training for female climbers right now, is like hormonal fluctuations, the menstrual cycle, like how much does this matter? Should we be thinking about it? And I think this is it's an interesting topic for me on a number of levels, obviously from a personal point of view, because I think it's something that for me, when I learned more about, and I could sort of pinpoint all these like patterns in my climbing, actually just from a point of learning about it and understanding it, I just felt like a little bit sort of, I think it helped my mentality, it just was this, I could be like, oh yeah, this is that. And for me, I think say like I gain quite a bit of water weight, there's a point where maybe you think, oh gosh, I feel really heavy, or maybe am I over fueling myself, or I think you can get, it was for me, I think, a point of bit of like a negative self-talk, whereas like I think once you understand the reasons behind it, you can look at things a bit more objectively. But I think the sort of more like broad sort of part of the topic, and I don't know whether you have seen this, but I think that there is less women in climbing, and like there is also like a dropout rate for sport, say when girls sort of go through puberty, and there is like a dropout rate when women reach the menopause or postpartum, coming back after having a baby. And I guess I feel like in educating or having the menstrual cycle or hormonal fluctuations just out there and sort of being spoken about and not this sort of taboo subject, I guess I hope, and I think probably will, it just breaks down the barriers there, and maybe we can sort of, rather than, you just hope that it continues to make climbing or sport or any exercise or the outdoors an accessible place through like different life stages that a female goes through. So, I think that is like a really sort of useful maybe part of opening up this conversation a bit. But I do think it's a balance, I guess, and I'm sure you guys feel the same, and I feel it myself, between sort of accepting that these fluctuations might have an impact on some things that we do, but not sort of thinking that they prevent us doing anything, and not sort of having this predictive feel to it, like you think that you should feel this way every month. I think it's actually quite interesting, say, when you think about PMS, this quite like classic thing everyone knows about PMS. But actually, if you look at the distribution between different countries in whether females report whether they experience PMS or not, it's wildly different. But obviously, female physiology is not that different country to country. So I guess what I'm saying there is that, like, I'm very much on, but like, I think there's like obviously all these symptoms which females very much experience, and there's physiological, like, underpinning there. But I also think there's a sort of culture to be nurtured in the predictive nature of them. I think there's obviously a cultural impact on whether females report whether they experience PMS, and it's just quite an interesting point of view to think that we sort of want to educate on this point without sort of making people oversensitive to the fact that they do have these symptoms, and like, maybe it's like when someone says to you like, oh, do you lose motivation each month around this time, and you think, oh yeah, maybe I do. I think there's always like an idea planting, effect there. And so I think there's a balance to be had there. But I think once you go, I guess that's like a more broader sense in where I feel that like opening the conversation up around here will hopefully have a positive impact. But I think from a more sort of training for climbing point of view, like, should we keep track of when our periods are, or like when we're experiencing symptoms? And I think from a really sort of like basic level, I think that this is good to do from a health perspective. I don't know whether, like, well, obviously you did your podcast with Mina Prerna, and she has obviously been recovering from Red S, and I guess she wrote a really good article about that, and we did quite a lot of in-team learning about that within Lattice, because I think there's just the female health here. Like, this is just female athlete health in a sport which is weight dependent. So when they look at the prevalence of Red S, a sport being weight dependent is a massive component for its sort of prevalence, which you can understand. And I think that just sort of looking at your own cycle, keeping track of it alongside training, I think it's just this marker of our health, which I think is a very useful thing to have alongside physical training or mental stress, because like going back to that sort of bucket analogy, it's not just physical training that could cause upsets to our cycle. It could be emotional stress or stress at work or anything. So I guess I think that looking at cycles alongside training from that point of view is definitely helpful. And then sort of in terms of optimizing training and longevity, going back to sort of injury prevention and stuff, I think that there is an important role that it could play there, but it's a little bit, I think it's sort of an additional tool. It's sort of a second tier. If I imagine building this foundation in training, I think it's this second tier that you apply if you feel that something's not working. I think that women are a bit like, you potentially, and I can see, I love the complexity of this stuff. I love hormones. Obviously, like I said, I've got that science background, and I understand that that's my own problem. But I think, it can feel overwhelming. I think, it can be like, oh my God, is this whole other thing that I have to consider on top of all this other training and exercises and intensities and loads? And, you feel like actually that's a lot of information. I guess what I consider it's this second tier of this sort of thing that you can use if there is something that you are experiencing that it's not quite working. Like with anything in training, like we're all individual. If a certain session isn't working for you, or a certain distribution of training loaded weeks to those sorts of rest weeks, we will always look to troubleshoot that, to find out what is best for a person. And I think just with females, this is just one of those second tier things that if you feel like energy levels are fluctuating quite a bit, or that recovery is impacted, or that your shoulders are always feeling a bit niggly around a certain time, if that pattern is reoccurring, then I think that adjusting for that will likely help. But what I think it's not, I think we have to try and not get overloaded with the information. We don't have to adjust for every little thing. Like when you look at the research and all the symptoms that are listed, throughout a cycle that are experienced by different women, one thing that you really notice is that there is such a massive range of them.
Yeah.
So I think that in educating ourselves, what we need to do is sort of, it's like cherry picking, the sort of the ones that work for you. And I think that having someone you can work with, or looking at resources online, or that general education is the first step. But I understand that could be overwhelming. So then it's sort of stepping away and trying to think, but what do I actually need? And I guess with the females I've worked with and with myself, when I actually narrow it down, it's a few small things that I can just make some little tweaks, and actually it just makes things like my recovery better. I now feel way less injury prone. And I think it's sort of, I think what I realized and what I hope to sort of share is that it can be a bit of a two birds, one stone thing. People commonly talk about sort of injury risk, recovery time, and maybe motivation. And I think that can seem overwhelming, because it's wow, there's three things to try and juggle and fit into my plan and sort of work around. Whereas actually for me, say with those three things, if I just shuffled around the periodization of my plan to have a deload week at a certain time, I did less training in that week, so I recovered better, and therefore I was more motivated for my sessions. So I think that there's like with a lot of things in training, there's a lot of crossover between these aspects. So I think that what if like any female feels like there's something that she's like troubleshooting, like recovery or like not making progress in a certain area, then there's probably actually one simple change you can make, and then you leave it and you see what effect that has sort of 3 months down the line. And I think that sort of approach where you think of it as like, you know, a pyramid, and you build a strong foundation, and then you make these sort of higher tier, like second tier, third tier changes that become sort of smaller and smaller percentages, if you know what I mean. Because ultimately, I think a lot of people are talking about like synchronizing training with menstrual cycles, which I do think is a good idea. But underneath that, there's just, are you periodizing your training at all? You know, are you doing the right sessions that work on your relative weaknesses? You know, there's sort of this bottom tier, which I think will have most impact. And then it's like a secondary thing. And I guess I hope that if that's the sort of message that's put out there, it's not this massive, overwhelming sort of thing. It's more just like this extra tool in your toolkit that might just optimize your experience in your training. Yeah, I guess that's sort of like my view on it. I think it's a very like multifaceted topic.
Yeah.
But one that I guess I do think that educating around the subject is useful, and I have like found it personally useful. And then I've worked with people where it's maybe just one change, and they're actually like, oh, you know what, I can just rest more during this week. Like, and really, you're going to have that rest week at some point anyway. So just shifting it is not sort of, a big deal. And I guess that's what I think. It's the risk that this is seen as like something that hinders, you know, this way in which females are different, that's sort of really holds us back. But it's not. It's just something to work with. Like, I think the research around this sort of area is interesting, in that it's often, I mean, it's very hard area to research, so it's pretty hard to pull any good solid conclusions from it. But in general, like, there's not a significant or massive fluctuation in sort of maximal performance in a lot of areas. And I think that's an important message to sort of put out there, that it's not ever at any point in your cycle that you can't do certain things. I think that where often, like where the research is going now, it's looking over sort of a period of time of training and the distribution of training. So a little bit more like putting that rest week, just shifting it to somewhere where maybe you need more rest anyway. And I think that's where over time we could probably see the effect. And I think that sort of distinction between never going into any day thinking you like can't do this thing, but in terms of more of like an accumulative effect, where it's just like month after month after month, maybe if like you rest more in a time when you need more recovery, you will therefore just be less at risk of overtraining, less at risk of injury. You know, I think that can only really be a positive thing to sort of educate people about.
Yeah, I think that's like a great like point.
Yeah.
Super valid. Just thinking of it as distribution of training rather than something that, oh, now how do I deal with this? Or something that has to be dealt with. Because I think that's like, you know, I've had, and I'm sure many like women have had these moments where, you know, a problem that would be a warm up or just like next to a warm up is suddenly so hard because you're on your second day. And I've found myself to be really negative around this time, and like instantly kind of feel bad about, oh my god, this is the, you know, this sucks. But well, this is just like your body, and the sooner you accept the various changes that it's going through, I think the easier you can be on yourself, and that's really what's needed. um, personally, I've definitely found like the one thing that has its moments of spurts and complete lack, where I've been in a place where I'm like, I don't think I can do this, and this is something that I can never do on this particular day of my menstrual cycle, would be like power stuff. I just feel like, I mean, even pull-ups feel like a really big deal, or just anything that involves this like explosive strength and power, it is so out of reach. And I want to also like if you can talk a little about power as something that women need to work harder to develop it, because there's obviously like like differences even there, in terms of how it's easier for men to adapt to power and powerful training. And like I've seen that progression happen in front of me, for a lot of guys that I climb with, and I'm still where I am, and I'm just like, oh, I don't know what happened there. So if you can talk a little about that.
Yeah, of course. And also just addressing like you said, you're saying there's like certain days of your month where you're just like, actually these things feel really hard. And you talked about accepting that. And I think that's what I've personally found useful, and that I know that other people have through just understanding a bit more, is that rather than sort of going more down that sort of negative self-talk pathway, there's this other pathway where you realize that for a start, this is called the menstrual cycle. So it is a cycle. So you'll know you're on day 2, but it's sort of this understanding that actually there'll be day 3 and then day 4, and actually then you'll be fine. And, I think it's very easy when it comes to stuff like this, or anything in climbing, when you're in the moment, it's very easy to be like, this moment is everything. It's sort of, it fills your whole sort of experience, doesn't it? Whereas actually, I think that view of the cycle as what it is, this whole cycle, like it's not just, I think, people used to think, oh yeah, the menstrual cycle, that's like your period. And it's like, well, no, it's actually this whole sort of reoccurring sort of window of time, and window of change. And I guess that's something that I find in like educating myself more about this, is that there's that change, that when I'm in those moments, rather than thinking, oh my God, I'm terrible, or, all these things, I just realized, oh, it's just this day. And actually tomorrow things will be different. And yeah, I think just having, for those in the moment things, just like having some ideas of how you can work on different things in your climbing. I feel like we spoke a lot about all these different areas of climbing, and obviously strength is a really like important part to develop in your climbing, but on those days there is also just a little bit of like just moving around on a vertical wall, practicing a little bit of sort of like gripping on, like relaxing your grip and moving like with a bit of like flow. So I think there are always like little adjustments you can make there that just help with those certain days, like especially when it comes to, like you said, like the pull up and power thing, which is not uncommon at all. I think it's probably, again, like a little bit like there's a few reasons that could play into that. I think that sort of like joint laxity and soft tissue laxity, there's been quite a lot of sort of research into that area for the injury risk side of things, but also for like power and like force development, like that ability to like pull really quick. And there maybe isn't such specific climbing research at the moment, but a lot of it's done in footballers with knees and like changing direction and stuff like that. So still sort of analogous powerful movements, but just not with the upper body. So I think there's like quite a lot of the sort of mechanistic understanding there, because we have like estrogen has quite a big impact on joint laxity. I guess because you think if you were to get pregnant, your joints relax in order to allow the pregnancy to develop and to give birth. So but obviously when that doesn't happen and you're just like dealing with that in the day, I guess in terms of like for a female, so leaving aside the part where it like might be harder to develop power for a female within a given cycle, there might just be those days where you choose to do more isometric work, if you're thinking off the wall conditioning, like there are just like ways in changing that. Because I guess when we think about optimizing training and we're talking about synchronizing with the menstrual cycle, I guess it's about getting the most out of the days that you train. And if there are certain days when your power is really down, it is probably just better not to train, these maximal things. If you do struggle with power, maybe it's more that it's just not a day to train power and it's one day, and you look to more sort of shoulder stabilizing work or isometrics or a different form of climbing training rather than that sort of max end powerful bouldering. But when you come, when that's not a thing and you're just looking to build power, like you said, you've seen your male counterparts just develop more power. And I think there are like I don't know like loads about it, but there are differences in muscle makeup. So when we use our muscles, say in our arm, there's different fiber types and they sort of cover slightly different areas in terms of like that more sort of what we call aerobic work, that's quite sustainable. It's like at the lower end of your sort of strength, and you could probably keep doing that certain movement for quite a long time. There's sort of muscle fibers that do that, and then there's like higher end of like muscle fibers, we call them higher threshold. So they're just those muscle fibers that are more, like you said, do that max strength, powerful pulling. They work really quickly. They contract with a lot of force over a short time. And there is differences in distributions of those between people, but I think there's also some like gender differences there. So that might be why there is just a slight difference in rate of progression, because you might just have less of those muscle fibers. Like I definitely sit in that boat. But then I guess it's like, if you have less of those, okay, how do we train them? Because it's not that adaptation isn't possible or there, it just might be at a different rate to someone else. And when it comes to power, I think something that a mistake I see that's like can be quite easily made and is quite common to make is that when we train something and we really look to target it, if we train it in a specific way, like we've sort of talked about a fingerboard, which obviously like you're looking to train your fingers, or a pull-up bar and you're training your pull-ups, there's often an intensity that you target. And in order to pull as quickly as possible and to work on our power and sort of like learning that sort of pathway of pulling as quickly as possible, we often actually have to work at a lower sort of intensity than we might think. So just to give an example, because I know it's like sort of a bit complicated to think about, say I can do a body pull-up and that is sort of 80% of my max. If I try and do that as fast as possible, my strength is actually limiting me in terms of pulling as quickly as possible. So if I want to develop my power, which is the speed at which I can pull, I need to use an assistance band. I need to make it easier so that I can really focus on pulling as fast as possible. And I think that's where I think there's sometimes a bit of a confusion. Strength and power sort of merge into one. And obviously they do on the wall. Like when we climb and we want to like transfer that sort of power training to the wall, there will likely be a strength element as well, because the moves will be hard for us. But I think when we really want to target something in order to like develop it a bit quicker, like you said, or like in a really like bit more of sort of an efficient way, we actually want to like, say if you look to do like pull-ups and like really fast pull-ups to sort of fire up, get that neurological adaptation, you probably just want to try and do them like at about 40% of max or something that allows you to really focus on that. And I do this I'm not a very powerful climber at all. So on the wall, I, of course, when I'm doing like my project level bouldering, my high end stuff, I will be using some power as well. But sometimes I might just be like, I'm just going to try and focus on power. And I take boulder problems that are actually probably not super hard for me. I try and climb them in a really powerful way, and I think that again can be a good way just to actually get a bit more comfortable with that powerful sort of way of moving. And then when you go back to the things that are hard from you, I think you've sort of, it's always like a tying together process. I see like with training, and when you realize, oh, I want to get better at this certain element, we sort of break everything down and then put it back together. And I think what you break it down into is what sort of can end up determining how well you train a certain area. So I guess with power, that is maybe a good way to go, because I think most people look to work at body weight, and obviously climbing is a body weight sport, but actually there's a lot of value in going like sub body weight when it comes to like trying to just pull really quickly before progressing it like back into your climbing. Yeah, so I don't know.
So I feel like we've spoken a fair bit about the physical aspect of training, and how it's different or how it needs to be dealt for individuals. We wanted to chat a little bit more about the mental aspect of it, especially considering that you have these hard, bold trad routes under your belt. I saw a video of Prinzip Hoffnung. It looks absolutely scary. So can you talk a little bit more about how you deal with fear, large runouts? How do you train for it?
Yeah, of course. I guess if I just like sort of take a step back to like I said, when I got into climbing, it was very much trad climbing from the beginning. So in a way, I think I lucked out a little bit in that a large portion of my climbing initially was just outside, going trad climbing, building up really gradually, just very gradual expansion of comfort zone. Like I think, and that's what I try to do now, but I think I just slightly looked out by sort of building a foundation for myself there, and just like who I started climbing with, what they taught me. So I think I have a little bit to owe to that, because I think that sort of going back to the point, where you see this like end result, and like you said, maybe you like see a photo of Prinzip Hoffnung and it's like, oh, that looks scary, but I've actually just done loads of climbing, and at some point in my climbing there was another Prinzip Hoffnung. It wasn't that great, it was just easier, that was just that next little step, like out and out. So yeah, I think that's sort of an important point to start with, that like this sort of development of the mental side of climbing has just been a really gradual one, and that I'm not like always like, I still get scared, I've not sort of like pinpointed some exact formula that means that I never get scared, but it is something that I've thought a lot about, I guess because of the sort of climbing that I've done. And I guess a few things that have really, I find useful, there's the sort of, there's sort of like the techniques for like dealing with fear when climbing and sort of learning to fall, and maybe I'll do those like afterwards. But I guess the primary thing for me that I look for is that if I lay out a challenge for myself, I guess I really try and think why I'm wanting to do that. I think looking at our motives behind things, laying out our intentions in like, a pretty truthful way with ourselves, I think is a very good place to start, because then when you do find something hard or you get a bit scared, maybe if I am like trying something a bit scary, I realize that this was part of what I was looking for. And I remind myself of that. And I guess it makes me shy away less from that aspect of the experience. And it obviously doesn't make it instantly go away, but I think as like a sort of first place to start, if I'm getting scared on a trad route, I guess that sort of like reminding myself, this is part of the challenge you look for, and why, and you find it valuable. And I guess the reason I found it valuable is that through doing it in the past, I think there's a certain amount of like agency, a sense, like you say, like a sort of a sense of being in control, a sense of self, when you push yourself out of your comfort zone a bit and maybe get a bit scared and sort of then work your way through that. I think that process in general is a really good one for being in climbing, but it's sort of just like a life lesson, isn't it? And I guess that's what I really like about the sort of transfer of that mental side of climbing. Like obviously I love the physical side and like the challenge there, but that doesn't really I mean, maybe my shopping bags are easier to carry or something because my arms are a bit stronger. But, outside of that, that physical aspect is maybe not transferring in the same way as I think the development of the mental side of things. Because, I think that sort of general process I then can apply to lots of things in life. And I think there's just a sort of building a confidence in your ability, to go into a situation, judge it, not at face value, but sort of relative to your ability. Because I think that's what, with a lot of like trad climbing, because I've spoke, I think a lot of people have asked me about this and they're a bit like, oh, maybe you're really brave. And I'm like, I'm not really. It's just that through a gradual sort of building up, this sort of the sort of a climb that I might try now, a trad climb, is of a sort of a grade that externally is perceived maybe as like scary, but relative to my like ability on that climb, say with Princip, the climbing for me, I didn't set off thinking, oh my god, this climbing is desperate for me, I'm definitely going to fall, and like, this is like weird. That would be so overwhelming,
right?
So I think it's that ability to look at something and be like, oh, this is a certain graded climb, it's got a bit of a reputation, but to strip that away and just sort of like hone in on yourself, your ability versus the rock and what is given to you there in terms of movement, as well as like gear, and like the fall, and to sort of, rather than judge at face value, to judge in this way that is like very much in light of your abilities and what you were looking for. And I think sort of like just generally focusing on that part of the experience, I think sort of automatically reduces my fear a little bit. It's a bit sort of like some of how I approach it, I think of like as prevention rather than cure, in that obviously when you are getting on something and you're scared of falling, you can look to sort of cure that with like fall practice and stuff like that. But I also just, when I approach things, I think I get less scared if the sort of reason that I've chosen something, or staying, working on like my focus in the moment. You guys probably heard of it. There's a lot of talk about like flow states now.
Yeah.
As sort of feeling of being completely immersed in a task. And I guess when I've like felt that in my climbing, like on route like Princip Hoffnung, and I think it's something that probably, even if we haven't heard of that term flow state, if someone described it to you, you would be like, oh yeah, that is the feeling I get when I climb or when I do this thing that was a challenge for me. And I like really seek that. I think that that's a big driving force in my climbing, and probably in lots of people's climbing, even if they don't know it. And I think that flow as a state has certain sort of criteria, and I think if you try and match your challenge to those criteria and sort of focus on the things that allow you to get in that flow state, fear often drops away, if you know what I mean. So I see this as this prevention way of dealing with fear, because if you shift your mindset to view things in that way, potentially you reduce your fear around failure or like expectation or of falling. So I think I like to sort of approach my climbing like that in a sort of general mindset way. But of course, I do still get scared. Like, it doesn't remove like the fear aspect. And I think that then from sort of dealing with that, I think it is useful to take a practical approach. And I do that, especially if I've not been on a rope for a while, say, and there's just like, there's been a lack of exposure. Don't know, I mean, maybe you guys don't have quite the same with weather, but it basically rains here like all winter. And so you maybe don't get out on a rope. And I think where maybe people go most wrong here is that they think, oh, I've just got to get out and fall off, like that's fall practice, just taking loads of falls. I think if you go out and you just take these big falls and it really scares you, and then actually just what's imprinted on your memory is being really scared of this fall, I think you potentially like, you are doing fall practice, but you're maybe doing it in a way that's actually reinforcing feeling anxious and scared about the fall. So I think there's sort of just a step back to be a little bit more sort of gradual in the approach. I guess with physical training, like how I said with pull strength, you don't start training and then start trying to do one arm pull-ups. You would get injured. And I guess I try and shift that approach to falling. If I am feeling quite scared, I don't just go and make myself take a massive fall with my feet by the bolt, because that's going to be too much and I'll be like overloaded. And so I might just build it up from being with the bolt at your face, or, then a little bit at your waist, and instead try to sort of focus on feeling calm whilst I fall. And because I think that's when, that's what allows you to climb without that distraction of feeling scared. We're often more scared, I think, in the run up to the thing than the thing.
Yeah.
Most people, when they fall off, they're like, it's like, oh, I was so nervous, and then I fell and it was fine.
Yeah.
That's not always the case, obviously, with dangerous routes, but for most of what we do, most of the time, like even if I every so often, do like to challenge myself on a certain trad climb, the majority of my climbing is like within much more like safe limits, and like, so the fear I have of falling is my perceived fear and of the risk. It's not that I'm actually in danger. And so I think that trying to focus on like actually being calm and relaxed in the face of a fall, I guess that's what I see fall practice as being about, and that sort of gradual exposure rather than sort of going in at the deep end, as it were. And sort of, I think a lot of people do that and then they actually just scare themselves more. And I don't know why people do, whether they feel like, because obviously rationally they know it's safe, they feel like they shouldn't be scared, rather than, and that comes from an expectation of themselves and the situation, rather than being a bit more objective and being like, oh, I am scared today, like this is what it is, like it is not that natural to fall. And how I'm going to deal with it is just sort of gradually building it up. I think it's sort of like respecting that mismatch between sort of fear and actual risk, and that mismatch is sort of okay. It's not like someone, I quite often hear like the words like should, like I should be able to do this, or like I should just take these falls and I shouldn't be scared. And I think that, maybe the language, maybe there's a bit of like something we nurture in the language we use there. I'm not sure. That means that people don't apply that same just like gradual approach that they would in their physical training.
Right. Yeah, it seems like it's about reinforcing a positive mindset in like small gradual bits, whatever's comfortable, so that you can gain confidence in your own abilities and just manage the risk better.
I guess that's what I think of it. It's like this sort of expanding of the comfort zone, rather than the comfort zone being here and you suddenly being out here and being really uncomfortable. It's a balance, because I think, you do have to be a little bit uncomfortable. I'm not saying you can't just work within your comfort zone and become more relaxed, in like the face of a fall. If you find that scary, like there does have to be a stepping out into, a scenario that is uncomfortable for you. I think it's just that you don't want those steps to be too large, like in any one like given time, because I do think that can sort of reinforce feeling very anxious in those situations. And I think you can also focus like alongside like sort of the falling part, there's the fact that thinking about the fall is just you're being distracted from the climbing itself. And I think that maybe what I've done, like when I have certain projects or whatever, is to try and work on that focus and not being distracted. And I think that can help. And it's quite individual. I think people need to find something that, I actually personally, I don't know if you guys do like maybe do yoga, or I actually don't do that much yoga, but I know that is something with the breathing in time with the movements is very much something I think people find helps them with focus, and you could transfer that to climbing and breathing in times with certain movements, anything that like sort of keeps you focused on the climbing itself.
I picked up this thing that you said, Maddy, that this ability to put yourself out in the comfort zone is also related to an expectation of yourself. Um, I want to ask if that differs, if you've seen that differ for men and women, and or just like especially in the case of women, um, is there more apprehension in being in that zone of discomfort, in being able to push yourself, and somehow, basically, I want to ask: are women more scared, and are women, do they feel more fear? Why do they feel more fear? Because that's been a personal experience, and around me and us, what we've seen has, it's the first thing that is visible between a beginner climber, from a beginner to like even um, an advanced climber, that there's more, or maybe it's expression, I don't know. Maybe women express more,
Mm.
and but I'm not sure about this, because we also see, like, a lot of, like, in terms of performance, the guys do end up like going for it way more, with way more conviction than women.
Yeah.
Even if they don't have the strength needed, like they're just more fearless. And
Mm.
so, yeah, no, I mean, what's been your experience?
Yeah, I mean, and like with most of the questions and why they're interesting, I feel like there's often quite like a few different avenues. So going back to, yeah, like I sort of said before, like how I think definitely something that can impact fear is like sort of expectations, having, I guess, a mix match between our expectations of ourselves and the reality of the situation. I think that, yeah, that can play a big role in sort of fear of failure or fear of falling, or the fact that those two are probably can be interlinked in numerous ways. And that I actually, from my personal experience, but I guess I work very much within the sort of physical side of things in terms of training plan writing and coaching in that way. And I don't do the mental side of things so much with coaching. I mean, I like it as part of the communication with the climbers I work with, but I probably don't have the best overview of the gender distributions there. But anecdotally, from like who I'm surrounded with, I think from that side of things, I actually don't necessarily see a massive gender difference or sex difference. Like, I actually know lots of men who really struggle with, especially like fear of failure, expectations, the ego is in there. I think that there potentially is just when it comes down to that, a slight difference in expression. Like you said, I think that maybe potentially in like a community, a female is more likely to share that with her friend more openly, or with her climbing partner, and maybe in general men keep that a little bit more closed up, and that goes down, I don't know, into a much bigger picture probably of our like gender roles in our society and stuff. And I think when it comes to that, potentially men are, it's harder for them maybe to approach it or to seek help. They might feel like there's more of a barrier there with that. But sort of, so I think in general with that, I actually don't personally see, like, I see just a range. I think it's very like individual. Something sort of going back to the cycle thing, something I hear from a lot of female climbers and have experienced myself is a fluctuation in that throughout my cycle. And I can definitely at times feel like, oh, this is like a scared day, and this does come around. And then there's maybe a bit more of like whether we can try and use whatever tactics work well for us, whether there's some like focus exercises, whether like maybe there's a bit of meditation or yoga or things you can do before climbing, something that like, or like whilst you're climbing, maybe to start off the day you do a few small full practice, building up a bit so that you feel like a bit more comfortable for the day.
Thanks, Maddy. This was great. I feel like we can kind of sum it up in this, aspect that climbing teaches you that there's multiple ways to approach a singular thing, and it's all quite individualistic. So being aware of the self and being more in tune with what works for you and finding that out. This was so great, Maddy. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was lovely to speak to you guys.
We feel it's conversations like these that facilitate the exchange of ideas and knowledge. If you have any feedback or training specific questions that you'd like addressed, please leave them in the comments below and we'll be happy to consider doing a part 2.